Every profession has its stereotypes. Police officers are supposed to love donuts, cowboys are supposed to be silent and dangerous, yet wise, used car salesmen are supposed to be irresistibly attracted to hair grease, smooth talk, and shady deals. And philosophers, too, have their stereotypes. We are supposed to be socially awkward eccentrics who sit in our chairs refusing to contribute to the world around us. Of course, some philosophers, like Kant, fit this mold precisely. Others, however, including the two we are covering today, do not fit the stereotype. Well, at least not completely. There is no denying that both Bentham and Mill were eccentric. Mill was a child genius, fluent in Latin and Greek by the time he was 8. Bentham, on the other hand, had himself mummified so that he could attend meetings at the University of London. His mummy is still carted into meetings today and recorded in the attendance book as present, but not voting. So Bentham and Mill were odd ducks, but unlike the philosophical stereotype, these two guys got out from behind their desks. A lot. Indeed, both Bentham and Mill were heavily involved in the politics of their day, campaigning for the abolition of slavery, women's rights, animal rights, and much else. Mill was even a member of Parliament. You should keep this in mind while we are covering Bentham and Mill. Their writings are not those of isolated eccentrics, but rather those of extremely public figures, 19th century equivalents of people like Nelson Mandela and Al Gore. Having thus given you an idea of the sort of guys Bentham and Mill were, let's see what they have to say. Bentham's ideas come first, both chronologically and argumentatively. He begins his ethics in much the same manner as Kant. If you remember, Kant began with a statement of what he believed the good ethical life to be. For Kant, the good life was having a good will, good motives. Beginning ethics in this way makes sense. You can't hit a target you can't see, just as you can't figure out how to live the good life if you don't know what the good life is. Thus, while Bentham completely disagrees with Kant as to what the good life is, he follows Kant's lead in beginning his ethics with a statement of it. Namely, Bentham proposes that the only truly good thing is pleasure, the only truly bad thing, pain. Now, Bentham doesn't attempt to defend this claim, and he really doesn't have to. If pleasure is good in and of itself, then it simply is good, and not able to be proved so. To see why you can't offer proof for something good in itself, think about trying to prove that a refreshing drink of water on a hot day is good. If this is the case, in this case, the cup of water simply is good, even though you can't prove it. Bentham's claim is simply that this is the case for all forms of pleasure. Having thus established that a life of pleasure without pain as the good life, Bentham must answer the second question all ethicists must ask, namely, how does one achieve this good life? Bentham's answer flows from his definition of the good life itself, namely, in order to achieve the good life for Bentham, one must act so as to increase pleasure and decrease pain. He calls this the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle. Note that the greatest happiness principle says almost precisely the opposite of what Kant says. Kant said, if you remember, that one achieves the good life by ignoring consequences and acting according to duty, while Bentham's greatest happiness principle says one achieves the good life by acting with only consequences in consideration. Having thus proposed the good life and means of obtaining it, Bentham goes on to explain how to evaluate actions as right or wrong, how the greatest happiness principle directs action. Basically, Bentham's idea is to add up all the pleasures and pains of each action, and then do the one that increases pleasure the most and decreases pain the most. Under such a system for deciding right and wrong, we are able to look at the world around us and observe what causes the most pleasure and least pain, and through this observation learn how to act. Right and wrong in utilitarianism are thus qualities that are provable and demonstrable in the same way the existence of gravity is provable. Other ethical systems, such as deontology, Bentham believes, cannot offer such certain objective and test-ready method of determining whether an action is right or wrong. Now, there are a number of problems with Bentham's view here, some of which are no doubt already crossing your minds. Bentham does attempt to work some of these problems out, but to be quite frank, John Stuart Mill is a better problem solver. So let's turn to him. Jeremy Bentham was a friend of Mill's father, thus something of a mentor to young John Stuart. And John Stuart Mill is definitely a chip off the old block. For the most part, he agrees with everything Bentham proposed. Pleasure is the only pure good, pain the only pure evil, and in order to achieve a good life we should act according to the greatest happiness principle. But Mill realizes that Bentham's ideas, like most profound ideas, have some significant problems. So Mill tries to patch these problems in the text we are reading for class, utilitarianism. The first problem is this. It is easy to read Bentham's greatest happiness principle as saying that the good life is a life of unrestrained pleasure-seeking, of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, if you will. This would be, I think most of us would agree, a terrible ethical system. It would be incredibly perverse if Guns N' Roses represented the epitome of the ethical life. Nickelback may be true in claiming that everyone wants to be a rock star, but it certainly isn't the case that everyone thinks rock stars are saints. Mill, though, asks us to take a second look. Living according to the greatest happiness principle, he points out, doesn't actually equate living the ethical life with the rock star life. This is so for two reasons. First, the greatest happiness principle isn't called your greatest happiness principle. No, it's rather that we should act so as to increase happiness in general. Many times, this will mean sacrificing our own happiness for the greater good. When we look at it this way, the greatest happiness principle was at work more in the life of Mother Teresa than it is in Axel and Slash. The second reason the greatest happiness principle would never lead to a rock star lifestyle, Mill continues, is that not all pleasures are the same. While there is pleasure to be had in eating, drinking, and being merry, there's ultimately better stuff out there. Indeed, if you think that rock star pleasures are the best, you've forgotten all about the pleasure of conversation, of reading a book on a rainy day, and of seeing a loved one after a long absence. When we think of pleasure in these terms, seeking after it doesn't seem all that bad. With this, then, Mill manages to calm our fear that living according to the greatest happiness principle will lead to venerating a life of debauchery. Next, he turns to a second problem with Bentham. Namely, while it might be true that we could observe the pains and pleasures caused by our actions, and through this observation determine right action, wouldn't it be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to do this complex math with every action? This, if you remember, was one of Ross's contentions with utilitarianism. Mill's response here is very insightful. He says, well, sure, adding up the pleasures and pains of every action would be impossible if we were the first person doing that action. But we aren't. People have been lying and cheating and giving to charity for years. Over these years, we have accumulated knowledge about which actions produce more pleasure and which more pain. So we don't actually have to take the time to add up the pleasures and pains of every action. Instead, we can simply look at human history and act according to what typically does produce the most happiness. With this, Mill is ready to address a third major potential problem with Bentham's ethics. Namely, is there any reason why we should obey the greatest happiness principle as Bentham suggests? Well, Mill replies, if there's a reason to obey it, it's got to be one of two things. The reason either comes from outside ourselves, from God and other people, or from inside ourselves, from our conscience. As far as God and other people go, the greatest happiness principle is precisely the sort of thing they would ask us to obey. Because if God is good and happiness is good, then it makes sense that he would want us to increase our happiness. And since the greatest happiness principle asks that we increase the pleasure of others, of course others are going to think it's a great idea and ask that we act according to it. So a reason for acting according to the greatest happiness principle can definitely come from the outside. But this reason can also come from the inside, from our conscience. Indeed, since humans are social creatures, it makes perfect sense that we would want to see our fellow creatures be happy. But wanting our fellow creatures happy is precisely a conscience that tells us to act according to the greatest happiness principle. At this point, then, Mill has shown that there is more than enough reason behind utilitarian ethics. Indeed, God, others, and our own conscience can ask us to act according to utilitarianism's greatest happiness principle. Also at this point, I have covered everything I wanted for today. Thus, I will end my lecture, in hopes that utilitarianism has begun to appear as a viable ethical option, as viable as Kantian-inspired duty-based ethics. For only when we begin to see many ethical systems as viable can we begin to think about which is in fact the most true to human existence.